Hello, everyone. Welcome back from the break. I'm Karin, and I'm a program manager on the Google Earth Outreach team. You're currently tuned in to the Geo for Good Summit's Climate Science and Communication program. Our next session in today's program is all about communicating climate change. Visualization and storytelling play important roles in raising awareness and inspiring action on climate change. In this session, you're going to hear from 5 speakers who have used mapping tools to tell engaging stories about climate change impacts and bring a visual perspective to the issues, ranging from the global scale to the city scale and all the way down to local neighborhood or street scale. There are several tools in the Google Mapping Toolbox that can be used specifically for communicating and telling stories around climate change. First, Google Earth Engine, our cloud computing platform for geospatial data processing, can be used for data science and analytics for a long list of climate data and climate science. Then you can bring all that data and analysis and create an Earth Engine app, which allows you to take any analysis and package it up in a graphical user interface and publish it as a web app to give people access to your scientific data analysis and results. Second, Google Earth, our 3D immersive map of our planet. Google Earth gives you access to Google's database of high-res satellite and aerial imagery, 3D terrain data, and street view imagery, and much, much more as an aid for your climate change message. You can add images, YouTube videos, slides, and other media that can help you tell your story. This past year, we added time-lapse to Google Earth to allow anyone to visualize the Earth's satellite imagery archive. Third, Earth Studio brings together the power of rich imagery database into a professional video and animation production environment. We originally created this as a tool for professional video production in the newsroom setting, where you can use Earth Studio to create animations that fly in precise and controlled ways throughout the world, and then bring that result into your 2D or 3D video production workflow. Now this is available for anyone. Today, we're going to hear from a few speakers highlighting how they've used these mapping tools for visualization and storytelling of climate change and its impacts. Our first speaker today is Liza Goldberg, a biospheric scientist at NASA and an undergraduate at Stanford University. Liza has created a project called Cloud to Classroom, which visualizes climate change data sets for use in the classroom.
Hi everyone, I'm so excited to speak to you today about the Cloud to Classroom initiative, which is a project I started several years ago as a partnership between Nat Geo and also Google and NASA. I am a sophomore at Stanford University, and I'm also a biospheric scientist at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. But before I jump into the actual content about Cloud to Classroom, I actually want to start with a couple headlines for you. So when the general public and when students think about climate change, they typically think about headlines like this from the New York Times, or like this from The Guardian, or this from the Washington Post. And when we put together the headlines that students and the public are seeing on a daily, monthly, and yearly basis, we think they should have a pretty clear consensus. We should be alarmed. But why is it that students and the general public just aren't alarmed? Why is it that they see these headlines and still climate change is a foreign thing to them, something that they still think they will never personally experience in their lifetime? In my eyes, the answer is pretty simple. They're simply not seeing its impacts across the world personally yet. When everyone in this conference thinks of climate change, we think of satellite time lapses like this over Great Salt Lake in Utah, for example. Or this time lapse over Alaska with the melting Columbia Glacier. We don't necessarily think of those bland, imageless headlines because we quite literally have the whole world of satellite imagery-based tools at our fingertips. The public simply doesn't have that, and therefore they can't personally experience these hotspots the way that we can. So then the question becomes, how can we bridge the gap between our science and Google-based tools and their understanding? And that's the part where Cloud to Classroom comes in. The goal of Cloud to Classroom is essentially to take Google Earth Engine and Google Earth, and also remote sensing as a whole, and put it in the hands of K-12 students and university students across the world. We think that these sorts of scientific technical tools shouldn't just be limited to those who have the technical expertise to actually deal with them. They should be given to those who will actually influence climate change just as we will, students, teachers, policymakers across the world, so that they too can understand and analyze the impacts of climate change on their community and other hotspots across the world. The workflow of Clouds of Classroom is pretty simple. We start with a Google Earth Engine backend where we're able to access dozens of satellite-based data sets that help students and teachers better understand different hotspots and also global indicators that they might see in biology and earth science curriculum. Within the Google Earth Engine JavaScript backend, we're then able to build a series of satellite-based apps that take those satellite data sets and those analyses that we're able to create within Earth Engine and make them publicly understandable so that students and teachers don't really even need to understand what remote sensing is, much less know how to code a line of JavaScript to be able to understand these trends and analyze how they're impacting their local and global communities. And the final stage here is taking these satellite-based apps and integrating them into biology and earth science curriculum in countries around the world. We deliver a series of trainings both in person and online to teach students and teachers both about remote sensing and satellite imagery-based analysis in general, and more specifically, how those analyses can be applied to their biology and earth science curriculum that typically would have just stayed confined to the world of headlines and textbooks. So just to give a really quick overview of at least a couple of our main content areas here that we're making these apps based around, we start with global trends like sea surface temperature, urbanization, and drought, where students are able to not only look at global trends in terms of how the whole world is being impacted by these different climate indicators, but also zoom into their local communities. We then have a series of local hotspot-based apps through ice melt and extreme weather events where students are actually able to zoom into hotspots that we personally selected as being the most dramatically influential and really vivid experiences for students to be able to experience these different indicators in a new way. We also have a global human influence-based app where students are able to kind of put it all together and see what the impacts of combining agriculture, urbanization, and other similar human effects might be on their community and on climate change as a whole. In order to build out these apps, we're able to take advantage of Google Earth Engine's really extensive set of databases. Everything from NOAA CDR data when we're looking at global sea surface temperature trends. We use Landsat 5 through 8 fairly frequently and really excited to start integrating Landsat 9 as well when we're looking at more of our localized hotspots through ice melt and extreme weather. We're able to take advantage of Nightlights data as a proxy for urbanization to show students how we can connect remote sensing to trends that they might not associate with it. And then finally, we're able to use other climate-based data sets like TerraClimate to analyze drought, and the GHM index, for example, to analyze cumulative human influence. So just to give a couple quick examples of what these apps actually look like and how they operate, here you're looking at our global drought monitor where students and teachers can use that upper slider on the left to analyze how drought has impacted different hotspots around the world over the last several decades. They're also able to view this data in a chart form, which is a really critical indicator in a lot of biology curriculums of being able to understand data in different forms. As we're showing here, students can then zoom into different hotspots both in their community and elsewhere to see how drought is influencing them, and then finally export this data as well. For our next app, I'm showing what a localized hotspot might look like as compared to our globalized apps like I just showed. Here you're seeing global drought hotspots where you can go from those global drought trends that I showed in the previous app all the way to localized hotspots that we selected. Here we're looking at Lake Mead in the United States, where students can really vividly see the impacts of drought over time, unlike they would have been able to in textbooks, for example. In this hotspot app, we're looking at global ice melts. Here we're looking at southern Greenland. This is again one of 6 different global hotspots that we selected as most representative of this particular climate indicator, really vividly helping students understand what this actually looks like on the ground. Here we're looking at our global scale urbanization explorer. Here, this is kind of a hybrid app where students are able to look globally at urbanization trends, but also zoom into these localized hotspots that we selected. In this case, they're looking at Shanghai. We're also able to integrate a time slider here where students can see over the last several decades what urbanization has been like for this particular hotspot, and then going further globally, they can see how it might impact their particular location. And then further, students are also able to, again, use graphs and other ways of analyzing data to further their data analysis skills and remote sensing skills as a whole. In our next app here, we're looking at another one of our local hotspot apps, in this case looking at hurricane disturbance. Here we're seeing the impacts of Hurricane Irma in the Everglades, particularly on mangrove ecosystems and local communities in this region. We've selected not only hurricane disturbances, but also things like tornadoes and typhoons in other parts of the world to really help demonstrate how climate change will cause a variety of different impacts in different climate systems in different regions. Here, for example, we're looking at this particular typhoon several years ago, 2019 in Japan, showing that these types of hurricanes and extreme weather events not only impact ecosystems, but very much impact cities, causing this whole city that you're seeing here to completely turn dark due to the power outages here. So again, making these sorts of trends a lot more real and vivid for students. So to give you a better understanding of where we've been with Cloud to Classroom, so far we've trained about 2,000 students and teachers, both in person and online, in 14 different countries. We've developed 18 online web apps, not just the ones that you saw, but also ones that are tangentially dealing with other climate change-related trends, 10 supplementary curriculums, and also 7 current event-based web apps that we're currently developing. So where are we going? We're expanding trainings to new communities across Latin America. We're translating apps to several languages. We're working towards real-time monitoring to help students better understand how these trends are evolving in real time, and also moving more towards the environmental justice arena with our apps. So where can you personally go with this? How can you integrate this methodology in your own work? For the scientists in the audience, go through each figure in your paper and ask yourself whether anyone without a PhD in the subjects can understand it. If not, it's time to go right back to the drawing board. We've come too far in the world of understanding how to communicate findings for, frankly, anyone to still be resorting to figures that are not understandable. For those who are more in the communication side of things to begin with, consider how you can reform your methods of communication to speak to all audiences, not just your typical ones. The key here is to find a middle ground between those on all sides of the climate communication field, the scientists, the press makers, and the policymakers, to facilitate the best possible way of getting the public on board. The bottom line is there's no miracle cure to the way we communicate climate change. Each individual absorbs information and is compelled by information in a different way. Maybe satellite imagery will work with some people, maybe hardcore statistics will work better with others. The key here is not necessarily searching for the perfect solution, the perfect chart type, the perfect data visualization, but rather just getting more scientists and conservationists to truly consider how to bridge the gap between their work and the public in the first place. Science can't be confined to the realm of just journals anymore. We're realizing that we're going to need to understand how to experiment, and we're going to need to fail to realize what works for different audiences. Ultimately, the point of Cloud to Classroom is not to find that silver bullet solution in using satellite imagery in this way, but rather to start a conversation on how we can revolutionize the ways in which we view and communicate climate education in the first place. And with that, thank you so much, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Liza. Our next speaker is Josh Williams, an educator from Round Rock ISD School and a longtime Google Earth user. Josh is going to speak today about how he has used Google Earth to help his students understand climate impacts on our oceans.
Thanks, Karin. Yeah, my name is Josh Williams, and I'm a high school teacher down here in Austin, Texas. And a couple of weeks ago, the GEO team reached out and asked me if I wanted to do this session on climate science and communications. And I was really interested. And it was kind of funny. They're asking, do you have any material or any projects that you can share? And I do. I have a lot of projects, but I was thankful that I had this opportunity to kind of develop a new one that's kind of been noodling in my head for a while. And it really is this idea of how the oceans and the atmosphere interact. So how does climate change interact with the oceans? Now, I'm not a climate change expert. I know where to find some. So thanks EPA and NOAA and NASA for the information, the great work y'all do. And the idea here is to create a story that engages young people and to looking at this exchange between the oceans and the atmosphere, and hopefully pique their curiosity on how climate change does impact their oceans. Now, for this, there's a couple of features that I'm using in Google Earth that kind of helps tell this story. The first thing I'm using is map tiles. So there's most mapping programs like Google Maps and other platforms, they use a pyramid tiling scheme that allows you to kind of wrap the world with the data or the visualization that you would like. The format is very similar to most of the other platforms where you find the URL and then you just put the level, the X and the Y. The examples are up here in the slideshow. If you're interested, like if you already have data in the Earth Engine, if you'll just go to the documentation and put export maps to cloud storage, you can tile your data sets and then you can layer them into Google Earth or Maps or what have you. So that was kind of the first piece that I wanted to put together in this story. The second thing I wanted to do was I wanted to organize it in folders. So what the folders are doing is they're allowing me to keep the story kind of in the storyline, but also allows me to nest some assets within each of these chapters where if students want to, or if you're just curious, you can kind of drill down and learn more about the measurements, the tools, and just kind of get a better and deeper knowledge of this interaction between the atmosphere and the oceans. What's also cool about the folders is that you can put the info panels in these folders. So instead of having an info panel on a point, line, or polygon, you just put it in the folder itself. And that allows you to move through the story without actually having to put a point, line, or polygon in the story. So it's going from like chapter to chapter to chapter. That's how the story flows. And in those panels, we have some custom HTML. That's kind of allowing me to design the page the panels the way I want it to look. But it's really used for me to allow me to show and hide these map tiles as we progress through the story. All right, so let me show you what it looks like, or how it gets organized. So here's the story. We have our splash screen, and then we have these nested folders. And within the nested folders, we have the actual different map tiles. So think of this hierarchy as the story chapters with the assets nested through them. This is the story itself that I'm trying to tell. It's from the Environmental Protection Agency, and it's climate change indicators on the oceans. And it's a really interesting story. All I want to do is make it more engaging to help pique that curiosity for students. And this is what it looks like. So it starts with our splash screen, and what that splash screen is doing in the background is it's showing all the folders that need to be shown in case somebody hid or did something weird. It's kind of aligning the scene together. And then I just click to explore. All right, so this first introduction is talking about the ocean itself and just describing it. So covering about 70% of the Earth's surface, the world's oceans have a two-way relationship with weather and climate. The oceans influence the weather on local and global scales, while changes in climate can fundamentally alter many properties of the ocean. And what I really enjoyed about that first kind of section is the scale of how large our oceans are. And NOAA has this great visualization of these draining seas. So when I'm going through the carousel, I'm just going to click the left here. While I'm going through it, the seas are going to be draining. And this is just to me, a really good engaging visual for students to see how large our oceans really are. So if I just continue to click through, the ocean is draining right in front of the student's face, right? So they're seeing what that 70% is. The why does it matter, the so what part about the oceans, right, is how we are dependent on the oceans, and the oceans are kind of dependent on us in the way that we treat it. And this first chapter is talking about the warming of the oceans themselves and the consequences of warming. And it really is about sea surface height and the changing height of the sea surface. The interesting part, for students, is they can click on the info panel and they'll get a quick little 1-minute video on rising waters from NASA. And then as you click through the carousel, they start looking at kind of the different features that they mentioned. So in the video, they're mentioning air pollution. They're mentioning the atmosphere. They're also mentioning how the heat content of the ocean is warming over time. They also mentioned sea surface temperature and how it's it's increased, again, unequally, but increased over time. And then lastly, the consequence of sea surface height. And if the student wanted to go on with the story, they could just move to the next chapter. But if they're really interested in kind of one of those components, they can drill down a little bit and just click on, let's say, heat content. And then in the heat content, what they'll see is the legend, kind of how it's measured, right? A brief description. And here they can look at it over time. So I'm going to come up here to Greenland. And right here, it's heat ocean content in 1960. I'm going to move it to 1980 by clicking the carousel. And then 2000. And lastly, 2011. So you get two scales. You get the scale of the map in the top right corner, but you also can move around and get the scale of anywhere that the student wants to, or anywhere that the teacher would like to guide them. You do the same thing for sea surface temperature. So I'm going to click on sea surface temperature here. The sea surface temperature, again, the legend is up there in the panel. And right now you're looking at 1995. So I live right around here in Austin. And my students and myself are very much interested in the Gulf and what occurs in the Gulf. So there's 1995. This is 2005. And then we get to 2015. So students are looking at a change over time of the sea surface temperatures. The East Coast is really interesting. This current right here is very interesting to watch over the time period as well. And then we get to the impact of the warming itself, which is sea surface height change. So this model is described in the video, about a 2-minute video on how this measurement came to be and the importance and the unequal distribution of sea height change. But after the video, the students can explore the change itself. And then they can even look at the change over time with this graph starting from 1880 going all the way up to 2020. So once the students take a deeper dive, just looking at the changing temperature and the impact of changing temperatures, we go to kind of the next climate change and the impacts on the ocean. And that's acidity, right? So this idea of the oceans becoming more acidic and then the dangers of that change to the chemistry of the ocean. And this is the brief description of the change. The video does a much better job, in my opinion, kind of describing the change and then how it's measured. So that one's about 3 minutes long. But again, the video talks about this respiration between CO2 in the atmosphere going into the oceans. So that's what that first map is. The changing pH levels of our oceans. Argonite, and then a way of measuring this change. And then lastly, this coral bleaching. So one of the outcomes of both heat and acidity of the ocean is the danger to our corals and other kind of small ocean life. And just like the last chapter, if students want to take a deeper dive and look at these models that have been made by NASA and NOAA, they can do that. So this is that CO2 exchange from the atmosphere to the oceans. And in the video, it mentions to stay north. So we're going to stay north because that tends to be where a lot of this exchange takes place. And right here we have 1900. And the model takes you to 1940. Then the model will take you to 1980. And lastly, it'll take you to 2020. And I was really interested kind of off the coast of Japan here, that change, kind of towards in the northern hemisphere. So there's your description of the exchange itself. And that should lead, or hopefully leads the students to clicking another button, which is always fun for them to do. And this is looking at the changing pH level. So again, 1900, 1940, 1980, and lastly 2020. And it gets really bright right there. The video does, and the description does a good job talking about or discussing the importance of these minor changes and the exponential impact these minor changes do have on our environment. Argonite's the same way. I'm going to stay in the northern hemisphere because this is where a lot of that respiration is occurring, and also where a lot of that pH imbalance is occurring or change is occurring as well. So there's Argonite in 1900. There it is in 1940, 1980, and then 2020. So these kind of 40-year generational time spans where it's cutting in. And like sea level height, the impacts of coral bleaching, both by heat and also acidity. So I go back to the story, and then we get to the future trends. You know, what if we don't change? What are the impacts? What I really like about this section is it talks about the decades and decades of repair that's required, that it's a very slow process to turn back this clock, or to help nature and to help our relationship with nature. The visual itself here is looking at storms, because I think that a lot of students are very interested and they're engaged, especially where I'm from in Texas, about hurricanes and the dangers of hurricanes and the intensity of the storms as they're getting more and more intense the closer and closer they get to the coast these past several years. So that's kind of the visualization. It talks about the data set here. But that's kind of the end of the story in and of itself.
Thank you, Josh. Our next speakers are Leila and Kelly from Climate Central. Leila is a senior software developer and Kelly is a project manager, both of whom work together on a new project by Climate Central they'll be describing here today called Picturing Our Future.
Hello, everyone. We're really happy to be able to speak to you today about how Climate Central is using a number of Google tools to communicate the science of climate change. First, a little background. Climate Central is a nonprofit organization based in Princeton, New Jersey. We're a group of scientists, journalists, climate communicators, and software engineers. And we're focused on researching and communicating climate change impacts and solutions. We try to make climate change relevant on a local scale so that people can understand how climate change may affect their day-to-day lives, both now and in the future. One of our main focuses is on how climate change is affecting sea level rise around the globe. And over the past few years, we've been making good use of Google's tools to help people visualize these effects. We'll be speaking to you today about a project we just released that used Google Earth Engine, Google Maps API, Google Earth Pro, and Google Earth Studio to visualize how the pollution choices we make today may affect sea level rise far into the future. So to briefly go over our agenda, we'll first discuss what motivated this project, and then we'll get into how the different Google tools we use played a part in various aspects of it. We'll then discuss the sort of impact the project has had so far, and finally, what impacts we hope it will have in the future. So, how does global warming affect sea level rise? Well, it increases sea levels both by heating the oceans and causing the water to expand, and by melting land ice, such as the Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets. When we're considering the effects on ice sheets, it's hard to exactly estimate how long it will take for ice to melt, given the vast quantities of ice involved. It's like if you dumped a truckload of ice onto the pavement on a hot day, you know for certain it will all melt eventually, but it's hard to estimate exactly how long it will take. But given a certain amount of global warming, we can estimate how much ice will eventually melt though it may take centuries to play out. CO2 emitted today has the ability to stay in the atmosphere for hundreds of years, and it will continue to warm the planet as long as those molecules are up there. So the effects of our past and current emissions will be felt for generations to come. But the choices we make going forward will still have a big impact on the world those future generations will inherit. So for example, the land that could stay above high tide line if we limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to 3 degrees Celsius is currently occupied by more than 4% of the global population. To help illustrate the effects of our pollution choices on sea level rise, we used Google Earth Engine and Google Maps API to show differences in the amount of land that could eventually be underwater, depending on the extent of future global warming. Now, sea level rise maps are only as good as the elevation data they're based on. Airborne LiDAR is one of the best sources of elevation data, but it's not available in all parts of the world, particularly in developing countries. So we use our own proprietary elevation data called Coastal DEM to model elevations outside the US, and we use elevation data from airborne LiDAR within the US. We use Earth Engine to create a mosaic of these two elevation models, and then we subtract projections for future sea level rise to identify land that would be below the projected high tide line. We use this process to generate two different layers that allow users to contrast sea level rise projections associated with a lower level of global warming with those associated with a higher level of global warming. Then we use Google Maps API to integrate this map into our coastal risk screening tool. So here's a screenshot of what that tool looks like. You can adjust the lower temperature and the higher temperature to see what additional land will be at risk under the higher temperature scenario. Although these maps are great at providing a bird's eye view of land at risk, we also want a way to make the consequences of our pollution choices more real to people. Kelly took on that enormous task, so I'll let her tell you about it.
Thanks, Leila. So in order to really bring home the findings of our research and maps in a simple and visceral way, we created visualizations showing what iconic places around the world would look like after different amounts of global warming. The first step in this process was to identify locally important places that would be in trouble if we allow global warming to proceed unchecked, but could be saved if we cut emissions and limit warming. To do that, we used Leila's wonderful map, which highlights the areas we could save in the map shown here on the right there in yellow, and compared those areas to locations of culturally or economically significant sites identified in large part through Google's Things to Do pages. Once we'd identified our locations, we created the visualizations using Google Earth Pro and Google Earth Studio. We used KML layers designed to look like a water surface and set their elevations to the future sea levels associated with different amounts of global warming. Combine these layers with Google Earth's 3D buildings and you can get almost photorealistic images. We've actually made similar images for a previous project, which we released in 2015, where we created a number of visualizations of future sea levels by hand. These visualizations were extremely popular in the media, but given how labor and cost intensive they were, we could only create a handful of them. Using Google Earth has allowed us to scale from a couple dozen images to over 1,000 images across 121 cities in 43 countries. This means that even smaller cities like Wilmington, Delaware, or Gulfport, Mississippi can see how climate change and sea level rise could affect them. You can find our full collection of images at picturing.climatecentral.org, shown here on the right. And now I'd like to show you a couple of these visuals. So here we have the Plaza de España in Seville, Spain, after just 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming. You can see that it's doing all right. But here's the same location after 3 degrees Celsius of global warming, and you can see that the site is almost completely inundated. We also present these images in interactive sliders that let you select which temperature increases you'd like to compare from the 1.1 degrees Celsius of warming we've already created to 2, 3, or 4 degrees of warming. And you can also see present day sea level. We've also presented this work as GIFs that fade between the 1.5 and 3 degree warming scenarios. And finally, for a dozen or so locations, we use Google Earth Studio to produce flyover videos also comparing the 1.5 and 3 degree warming scenarios. So I'll just show you a couple of those locations here.
So the impact these visualizations can have will only be as great as the extent to which people will see them. So we made it easy to customize and download views of the maps and the Google Earth images, share them on social media, and even embed them into websites and online articles. We released this work a few weeks ago, and we're pleased to report that we've had over 1 million visitors through the Picturing Our Future website so far, and over 2,000 stories have been produced across over 100 countries. We've also collaborated with Climate Interactive, a nonprofit think tank, to integrate our maps into their climate policy simulator called En-ROADS. En-ROADS is an amazing tool. It allows users to see the potential impacts of policy choices across a wide range of socioeconomic and environmental dimensions. These include air pollution, crop yield, energy prices, and a lot more. And the map integration now allows policymakers to also see how decisions affecting global temperature could impact future sea levels. Now is a particularly good time to reach decision makers because this year global leaders will be renegotiating their climate pledges at the UN Climate Conference in Glasgow. We'll be presenting Picturing Our Future at a number of events there with our partners, which include Chatham House, the International Science Council, the Association of Small Island States, and Climate Action. It's our hope that this project will show not only what's at stake in these negotiations, but also what we could potentially save if the world takes strong measures to limit global warming. So thank you so much for listening, and thanks to the folks at Google for being so supportive of our work and developing all the amazing tools that made this possible.
Thank you, Leila and Kelly. Our last speaker in this session is Anjali Singhvi, a graphics and multimedia editor from the New York Times, who led the visualization for a story about the climate crisis in Chicago. Take it away, Anjali.
Hi, everyone. I am Anjali Singhvi. I am a reporter and graphics editor at the New York Times. Today, I'm going to talk about how I made the visuals for an article written by my colleague Dan Egan that explores Chicago's water challenges involving Lake Michigan. The interactive article was published in July this year, and it was a collaboration between Times journalists on the climate desk, designers, and graphics editors. The story talks about how significant changes in the water levels of Lake Michigan, extreme highs and lows, could affect the population of the city. So when we first started reporting on this piece, we knew that visuals would play a big part in telling the story. And we brainstormed several ways we could show all the different things Dan talks about in the story in one big visual. All the canals, the high-rise buildings, water tunnels, reservoir, and of course, the Lake Michigan. And we decided to use animations from Google Earth Studio for some of the visuals because it captured everything we wanted to show in one piece. And then we paired it with excellent photography that you see here and a map graphic to piece it all together. So this is the cover of the piece. It's a 4-step animation. As you scroll to enter the piece, the first thing you see is this bird's eye view of the city along Lake Michigan. Then when you scroll further down, it animates into a more oblique view of the skyline, showing all the high-rise buildings and their close relationship to the lake. And then it transitions into a front, almost elevation view of the skyline. And then finally, the camera moves down into the canal and stops there. It also worked really well with the accompanying text, which talks about the skyline, the coast, the lake, and everything as a great introduction to the piece. And again, this was a great way to start the piece because we were able to capture 4 different scales of the city. In the story, Dan talks about these different levels. So in the graphic video, we have a bird's eye view where you see the buildings all along the coast that are vulnerable to the storm surge. and then a more axonometric view of the city. So you get the scale of the architecture and the built-up that's along the coast. Then the more human level near the canals and entrances to the buildings that get flooded in the storm surge. Another reason to use Google Earth Studio first was because we wanted to show how the Chicago city is as is now and how it would be affected by the climate change crisis. And the models and the textures were pretty updated, so that really helped us to show what the canals are like and what the building is like, and show it through the animation. The other option would have been to use a 3D model of the city to show the connection of the skyline to the coast, but then we'd run into some issues like the 3D model would not be fully updated to the latest structures, and then would need all the canals and waterways in the model. And one big thing would be we wouldn't have textures, the photorealistic textures that we were able to get in Google Earth Studio, and that was a big reason we decided to use it for that. And we're also able to do it fairly quickly in Earth Studio with a significantly less render time. So that was another big reason. For the second animation, in the piece, we wanted to show this vast reservoir that's been built in the southwestern part of the city. But we wanted to connect it to the first animation so readers don't lose a sense of orientation as to where this dam is actually located in the city. And for this particular one, using Earth Studio was really helpful and turned out to be pretty good because the dam is currently under construction, and we're able to show that because the satellite imagery and the textures were fairly recent, and that's why we did the animation from the canals. Again, this was a 3-step animation going from a view that showed the canals and city elevation to a top view, and then the camera basically follows the canal all the way to this vast reservoir and then settling into a more human scale level view in the reservoir. So a couple other things I wanted to do, but we didn't end up doing, was include KML files for water levels in the animation. I'm going to show you a quick demo of the file that I used. So this is the first animation, and we were exploring trying to add some water levels right around here. So when you're in the canal, we would have KML files to show you that this is where the actual storm surge would look like. And this is a more human scale, so you get a sense of what that would feel if this had a storm surge here. But there were a couple of challenges in animating, in like how to animate the water level in. So we decided not to use it, but that would be another area we would probably like to explore in the future, to add data to these animations. And I'm gonna quickly walk through what the final piece looks like. It starts with the first animation that I described, and one thing we did in terms of user experience is we hooked the actual video to the scroll. So what you can do is the reader can scrub back and forth in this video and pause and really control the speed and everything. It's not playing automatically, and that really helps for someone to pause, read, and take it all in. And what I did in terms of preparing to bring it onto the page, bring the video, is I used I rendered the video as high-res frames, and then I brought it into After Effects and adjusted some of the color, and then exported a high-res video from After Effects, and then hooked it with custom code to the page. So here, again, this is the same as the top video. You can pause, you can go back and forth. And using the high-res resolution export, I think gave us a really good sense of, with the textures, really good sense of what the city and the skyline and everything looks like. And then you can transition to top view, which is, again, that like this would not have been possible with any other tool to actually see what the geography looks like at present. So that's how we built these two main pieces for the story. And that's it. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Anjali, and all of our speakers in this session. Really exciting work. We're now going to move to our live Q&A. I'm here with Liza, Josh, Leila, Kelly, and Anjali. Hi, guys.
Hello.
Over the past little bit, all of you out there have been asking some great questions that we're excited to get started answering. And it's not too late. You can still submit your questions right below the video here. Okay, let's get to our first question. Actually, the first two questions that I have here are from Liza, or for Liza, from Emil C. and then Gemma N. The first one is, I think, a short one, Liza. He says, really nice apps. Would you be willing to include your apps in a Google Earth Engine list of curated apps? And can any of those links be shared with him?
Yes, definitely to both of those. So first, as to how to access the apps right now, we have a website called cloud2classroom.org where you're able to see all of the apps in kind of a cumulative sense and go through each one of our different climate indicators. But I think more importantly, as to your first question in terms of incorporating them into the kind of more cumulative list of Google-sponsored apps, I think we're absolutely looking to do that in terms of building a library within the Google curated app space. But what I'm personally really excited about is thinking about different ways we can actually make the code that was used to generate those apps more publicly accessible. I think while the Google Earth Engine code library already has a lot of really great different GUI elements examples where you can go in and, for example, look at how to make a slider tool or how to make a checkbox, for example. I think it would be really incredible if we were able to sort of incorporate fully fledged Google Earth Engine apps into those examples as well. So if a researcher or scientist is just putting out a paper and maybe doesn't have a lot of time to develop an app on their own, then they're able to use sort of the wireframe, the backdrop of a lot of our Cloud to Classroom apps as sort of a base to just switch out our data with theirs and more quickly produce an app to share with the public.
Yeah, thank you so much, Liza. If you're someone like me out there, I'm a code modifier, not a code writer. And so there's many examples as possible and be able to take that and just transition a little bit, change a little, modify it a little bit to fit my needs. It's really helpful. Okay, so next question for you, Liza, is very similar to what you were just saying. So I think it fits right in here. This is from Gemma N. Can you share the code for building our own split panel before and after style Earth Engine app so that they can customize it with their own data sets?
Yes, absolutely. So I think that code link is being pasted in the chat. But just for future reference, if you go in the Google Earth Engine code editor and look on the left tab where all of your personal codes are, if you go down to the bottom, you can see a whole list of already curated examples, one of which is the Split Panel app, which we're sharing the code for now. And I think, this is one of my favorite parts of Google Earth Engine personally. When I introduce Google Earth Engine to a lot of students, I think the immediate reaction is, I don't know how to code. How am I going to get started with this, especially if I'm not familiar with using satellite imagery to begin with? And to that, I say, honestly, you really can get away with using Google Earth Engine completely without writing any of your own code. If you want to be able to get access to the satellite imagery, even if you want to start doing some analysis on your own, you can truly get by just by using the Google Earth Engine examples that are already curated. So definitely check those out first.
Awesome. And so, yeah, if you want the specific code URL, you can find that in the Q&A. And I believe Raleigh and the team are pasting that in now. Okay, thanks, Liza. The next question is for Josh from Barrett H. Have you thought about whether this would be a good way in which you can establish social network exchange working groups on using these same projects, like, for example, your Earth Changing Oceans platform? What do you say to that, Josh?
I do. I enjoy presenting to teachers often, and I have a little bit of a network, always looking for more, I guess. I do have a blog, geteach.com/blog, and my socials are all on the top, right corner there or something like that. But the blog, for example, will go through the presentation itself. And as Karin mentioned earlier, a code modifier, exact same way right here. I'm a high school teacher. Geography high school teacher, and I've modified a lot of code in the last 10 years or so. And it pretty much walks you step through step how that was made, kind of a similar process. And that blog oscillates between Google Earth and Maps API, which is what geteach.com really is. And then also a little bit of Earth Engine. So it really has probably about the last kind of 5 years of just kind of things I've been tinkering with. I kind of use it as like a reflection where I build a project and I'll reflect off the project. I use that blog just to kind of post my reflection, to kind of share what I've learned and hopefully save some people a lot of time in the process.
That's awesome. Yeah, I've used it. So we're going to put that geteach.com blog post that Josh wrote specifically for the project that he shared with us today. We're going to put that in the resources tab. If it's not there already, we'll be sure to do that so you guys can see as well. So, okay, great. So the next question I'm going to ask to Leila and Kelly, and it's a personal favorite question of mine. One of the main audiences for Earth Studio projects are news broadcasters. And I know that Climate Central has their climate reporting resource system called Climate Matters, and that local news agencies then use your visualizations to talk about climate change and other related issues on the air around the country and around the world. I'm curious, have you found that local news have picked up your visualizations picturing sea level rise? Have you found that they've picked them up since you've launched a few months ago, I guess?
Yeah, this has actually been one of our biggest releases to date in like the history of Climate Central. Last I checked, which was about a week ago, we were approaching 2,500 articles or news segments that had used resources from this project in some way. And those include some big names like CNN and The Guardian and whatnot, but the most exciting to us is when a smaller newspaper uses it, newspapers that usually don't have the resources, and that's what we're trying to do is provide climate reporting resources for them. So it's really cool to see, a local newspaper in like Atlantic City use the pictures we've created of their hometown.
Yeah, and I have to say, it was from a personal perspective, it was really fun seeing these Google Earth visualizations come through my news feed as kind of like the hero image in the news story highlighting your project. So I was really excited about that.
Yeah, I was getting a lot of them too.
Yeah, that's awesome.
My feed.
Yeah. Great. So the next question, thank you so much, Kelly. So the next question is for Anjali from Jeanette, who's watching. Question for Anjali, really great graphics and storytelling piece. Any advice for scientists that are incorporating graphical storytelling to accompany quantitative data? Do you have any advice?
Sure, yeah. Thank you so much for the question. We work with scientists a lot on all sorts of data, and we use different kinds of storytelling for different data. So we use charts, we'll use interactive storytelling when it's required, but we can also just use a static graphic if the goal is to just if that's doing the job to explain the point to the readers. So it depends on what kind of data you're working with, but trying to figure out what you want to say about the data first. What are the 3 things you want the readers to take away from the data and from your story, and then using the appropriate form of data visualization for that in your story.
Yeah, it seems like it depends on the type of data that you are showing or the type of story that you're showing, what kind of data you might add on top of the map. That might really, make a difference on how are you going to orbit around it, or are you going to fly through it, that kind of thing. Yeah, really interesting. Okay, great. So we're going to come back to all of you guys again. I'll start at the top again, and I have a question for Liza. Cloud to Classroom is a phenomenal tool for high school students and really anybody else who wants to observe Earth observation data for themselves around the topic of climate change. Have you ever seen, the students who are using the course curriculum and using Cloud to Classroom, have you seen them move to wanting to edit behind the background code and like maybe use different data sets or a different timeline, filter different dates, basically build their own visualization as almost like a gate to learning code or something like that? I'm just curious, based on your experience with Cloud to Classroom to date.
Yes, absolutely. That's a great question. So I find that kids are really interested in applying the global climate trends that we're really stressing in a lot of our apps down to all the way to the community and local scale. I think it's really important for kids to be able to sort of translate what they're reading about in these sorts of global headlines and on our global apps to, how does this relate to my family and my community at home? And so we see kids, like, for example, in trainings that we ran in New York City a couple of years ago, getting really interested in applying sea level rise models to their local communities and searching on Google Earth Engine and getting interested in the code editor to try and get down to that local scale and see, let's find my house, let's find my neighborhood, and let's find a data set that overlaps with that, so I can really start applying, these crazy trends that all these scientists talk about. Let's put them in our hands and see what we can do with them. And I think, the whole youth climate activism movement has a lot of intersectionality with what we can do with data, and we're seeing that kind of trickle down to the trainings that we've done across the US, but also abroad as well.
That's wonderful. That's great. I can imagine it's such a, the fact that it's map based, the fact that it's, you can choose any data set that you may be interested in. So it's personal, right? It can really introduce students to a lot of coding concepts or whatnot. So that's awesome. A question for Josh. This, your geteach.com blog has how-to and, like you said, reflective blog posts from other projects that you've done. What is your, if the ocean's one that you just presented, let's say that's your favorite, what's your second favorite one that you've done and, basically built out a reflective blog post about? Can you tell us about another one?
Yeah, there's probably 2 that I really enjoy. There's a quiz one that I've created that's very reminiscent of the Voyager quizzes. This uses the custom HTML and buttons. That one's always fun to show people how to use and do. There was a really big push for audio, and that was what I did last year, I think, for Geo for Good, how to put audio files into these panels. And that's a very easy process to do. And going back to what Liza was saying, this idea that students it's changing 4 lines of code, and then the students can bring in whatever they want. So, for example, a project we did once was looking at, I live in Austin, Texas, at Austin's local culture, and the students were playing, songs and music that kind of fit, the cultural identity of Austin, and kind of flying Earth around, and just kind of seeing or capturing the street views that Earth had with the music. And it's really interesting because, some of those places have changed, in the last year. I mean, if you ran the Street View car through it right now, it'd be totally different. So, I mean,
wow.
5 years doing the same project it's pretty cool for change over time.
I would imagine that taking all of those school projects in, one collection, like a gallery, would be almost like a picture history from the perspective of students, right?
Yeah.
Right? Historical perspective or whatnot. That's really cool. Okay, thank you so much. So the next question I have is for Anjali, and this is a question that I actually have been dying to ask you because you're, probably one of the more advanced Earth Engine users I've met, besides, Patrick and the other ones that helped build it from scratch years ago. But I love your presentation because it talks about your process, your creative process, and also some of the technical process. And some of the technical behind the scenes of building a visualization like you did. And since you're pro at Earth Studio, I was wondering if you could basically tell me what is like the most complicated thing that you find yourself doing with Earth Studio, or maybe the hardest thing that takes time to build out. What do you think? What do you think is the hardest thing, or the most fun thing? I don't know.
Thanks for the question. I think following the camera along a specific path and then transitioning from different views, like from elevation to a top view, especially if the story requires us to cover like a really large geographic area. Those are the trickiest because we really want to be careful about not disorienting our readers or, induce nausea with too much movement as they're scrolling through the article. So really trying to keep the movements smooth throughout those animations is probably the most challenging.
Yeah, I bet. Because too much, then the viewer can get a little nauseous, but too little, they don't know if it's moving right, or they it's not as engaging. So yeah.
Right. Yeah. So we use different JavaScript techniques to hook the video to scroll, so a user can scroll it at their own pace, and so just making sure it's a uniform, smooth scroll.
Awesome. That's great. Thank you. So the last question, and then if we have time, I have one fun question at the end for everyone. But the next question I'd love to ask Leila and Kelly, and it's just about communicating these important issues and delivering these kinds of visualizations when you guys are communicating climate change. You guys, talk to local news media, you have curriculum, you have visualizations that you share on your websites, and at COP26 and other places. What do you think is the most resonating? This is kind of a philosophical question, and I'd love to hear, what do you guys feel like, or let me put it this way. Was there a moment where you were like, wow, this is a great way to surface these kinds of visualizations? People are really getting what we are creating here. Do you guys have a favorite moment like that? Or a favorite delivery mechanism?
Really, I'm interested to hear your opinion too, but I think it's really the most simple stuff that I think gets to people the most. So the images, I think, go the farthest, that most people see them. They have the most visual impact, but it is kind of a sliding scale where on one end you have the most people seeing it and being interested in it and emotionally impacted by it, and then on the other hand you have our most detailed information that gets used by actual practitioners like floodplain managers and the like, and that's all spreadsheet based and not terribly engaging, but maybe the most in-depth.
Yeah. And I think it also helps the messengers that we choose. So we work with meteorologists because meteorologists are a really trusted source of information. And so I think people, they trust their local meteorologists, and that's why it's really important for us to get these tools into their hands.
That's great. Awesome. Thank you. That's awesome. Yeah, I agree with that 100%. So we only have a few seconds left. So I'm going to do a pop quiz where you guys get one-word answers. And that is, what is your number one feature request for your tool of choice? Earth Studio, Earth Engine. Let's hear from you, Leila.
Earth Engine deletion protection for assets.
Nice. And we only have a couple seconds. So Josh, I'll pick on you.
Oh, I enjoyed listening this morning with the CSV files going in.
Nice. Oh my gosh, that's awesome. So sorry I can't get to all your guys' feature requests, but I'm always here if you want to tell me. And it looks like we're out of time. So thank you so much for joining us today. Please stay tuned for the Climate and Equity session and have a great summit. Thanks.
Thank you.